Now that we understand the very basic of using an armature, let's do a new bouncing ball animation, but with some more advanced mechanic. For this animation, we will be exclusively working from a side view. It's like working on a 2D animation in a way. So I will create a new action by duplicating our keying set and name it bouncing ball. It means that this action will keep the keying set we have created before or the keyframe we have inserted before. And I've enabled the only active keying set option in the auto keying and enabled the filter available. On frame 0, I will position my bouncing ball at about 9 meters on the z-axis using the root controller. This controller will allow us to move the ball in space, while the other will be used for secondary motion like squash and stretch and rotation or revolution of the ball. We can plan our animation by directly drawing on the screen. I'm holding the D key while left-clicking and dragging on my screen to use the grease pencil notes. Here I've made a beautiful drawing of the path of the ball that we are going to animate. The idea is to bring a bit of physics into it so that it looks more believable, and input a bit of damping until the ball stops. You can access your annotation in the View panel under Annotation and click the minus button if you want to remove it. As soon as you make a new drawing, a new annotation will appear. You can change the color by clicking the little vignette next to its name. These annotations are in 3D, so you can rotate around them. And you can create new annotation layers or new annotation slot by clicking the plus button. If you make multiple drawings on a multiple keyframe, a new drawing will be created on each frame, allowing you to do awesome animation with the annotation, or a crappy drawing like this one. All joke apart, it's very handy whenever you want to review your animation or plan the next move. Let's start animating our bouncing ball. I will select all the existing keys, press T and set them to constant so that we can start our new animation as we did before by the blocking stage. We will be animating in pose to pose by first setting our main keyframe or golden keys, then create some in between and then start polishing. So I'm currently trying to match the different extreme poses of the ball. The different poses when it hits the ground and the different poses when it is at its highest point in the air. Seeing that I don't have a green line between the keys on my action editor, I figured there was still a Bezier interpolation. So I've pressed T and reset to constant all the keyframes. As I've erased my annotation, I have a hard time figuring out the position of my ball. But there is a tool that could help me and that we have already used. It's the motion path. So while I'm trying to figure out the spacing of the ball from one frame to the other, it will be easier if I add an ID of the previous position of the ball. So instead of fighting with my animation and my brain trying to figure out or remember where the ball was in the previous frame, I will simply head up to the armature properties, not the object properties. And here I will find exactly the same motion path menu that we have seen previously. But this time we are using it at the armature level, meaning that I'm currently tracking my root bone. And I can track any of the bone of the ball or even multiple bone at once. I've previously set a couple of quick favorites I can access pressing the Q key. You can create your quick favorite or assign your own shortcut to any tool in Blender by right-clicking on it. From there, it's way easier to position the ball from one key to the other. I'm creating a new keyframe every 5 frames. This is pretty arbitrary, you could use every 10 frames or whatever. I'm used to use every 5 frames. And when all my golden keys will be done, I will then go into a slight timing pass where I will move all those keyframes left to right to revise the timing of the animation. Here I'm writing the ultimate pose, and then I will play my animation or scrub through the timeline to feel the motion. See if the up and down and forward motion feels natural. And this is something you have to train about. You have to train your eye about this. And this requires experience. And you will get experience only by animating, not watching videos. So even if you are a more advanced animator, I advise you to do this exercise. And if you are a beginner, embrace failure. Failing is an important step in the learning path. The sooner you accept failure, the faster you will learn. And being a good artist is not really about your success, but the way you bounce back after a failure and the way you learn from it. Alright, let's stop our philosophical discussion here and let's go ahead with animation. In my action editor, I'm moving all the keyframes of the ball on the timeline. The smaller the bounce, the fewer the frame I will have between two keyframes. And then I'm moving the latest pose pretty further away because the ball will be slowing down before it stops, so it will take some time to get there. To quickly manipulate the key, you can box select them as we have seen before, or click the summary so that you will get all the keyframes underneath. You can watch my timing on the timeline, but don't feel wrong if your timing is not the same as mine, because it depends on the 1/8 of your bounce. And we will certainly revise the timing during the animation. But try to make it feel as natural as possible as soon as possible. We will now start detailing this blocking path, meaning that we will add a few more keyframes and input a bit of squash and stretch using the upper and lower green controllers. I will start by adding those stretching and squashing information on top of the existing keyframes. As explained in the previous chapter, when the ball is contacting the ground, it reaches it at full speed, so it is full stretched. And since the first pose is the one where our ball has the maximum speed, it is the pose where it will be the most stretched. You can use the stretching controller to orientate the ball toward its previous frame. Just translate it a little backward. This controller only allows you to move it using its location, not its rotation. The ball will automatically stretch toward the green controllers. I will then scrub through the next frame, and with my green controller still selected, I will press Alt-G to cancel any location transform on it. I will take the lower squash controller and I will push it up just a little touch to make the ball squash when it slows down in the air. I can see that I have a little interpolation between my keyframes, so I will select them all, press T and reset them to constant. This happens sometimes when you try to add the constant interpolation on a single keyframe. So I will go ahead and input a bit of stretching and orientation to the ball on each frame. And as I go along, I will reduce the stretching strength on each consecutive bounce because the ball is losing energy. Each time I slightly translate the upper green controller toward the previous frame. And when it's up in the air, I'm slightly moving the lower controller up. I have forgotten to insert a keyframe on each channels. So in the action editor, I will go on each keyframe, press I and choose all channels. I can now add some breakdowns or in between to my animation. This will really help me reading the animation in the blocking stage. So what we are going to do now is add the squash just after the landing of the ball. Be very cautious with the squash and stretch because it translates the softness of the ball. If you're going too extreme, your ball will look like a water balloon. As impact occurs on frame 8, on frame 9, I will slightly squash the ball. Then on frame 10, before the ball is leaving the ground, I will stretch it a bit toward the next position. To do so again, select the upper controller and press G to move it toward the frame 13. See how after the bounce I'm stretching the ball less than before, because as it touched the ground, it's losing energy, so I can't make it stretch as much as when it was going to touch the ground. Again, I did a little mistake along the way. If you check frame 18, we can see that our bouncing ball is not touching the ground. And I'm offsetting its root controller to fix the problem. But the issue doesn't come from the root controller position, but from the second squash and stretch controller, the lower one. When I inserted the keyframe on all the controller previously, I forgotten to reset its position when the ball was touching the ground. So currently, this controller is still in its squash position as when the ball is in the air position on frame 22 and 13. And this is why the blocking stage is so important, because if I was already splining my animation, I would have a hard time to spot this, and I will be fighting this deformation with my curves. So with the lower green controller selected, I will go over all the keyframe and press Alt-G, and you can see the ball getting back into its original shape. And now I can fix the root position on each of those frames. Now, to make my action editor a bit cleaner and more readable, I will collapse all the panel because I don't need to see all the channels. And starting with the root bone controller, I will duplicate the frame 18 and move it on frame 20 and get rid of frame 19. Since the ball position doesn't change between those two frames, I don't need to have a keyframe in between. And duplicating frame 18 on frame 20 will ensure I have consistency into my animation, or at least onto the position of my ball when it's on the ground. I will also duplicate frame 26 on frame 27 because the ball is still on the ground on this frame. Then I'm checking each frame and I see that I need to revise a bit the squashing with the lower controller because it's still very strong on frame 29. So I press Alt-G to cancel it and then press G and hold Shift to move it on the Z-axis very subtly. From there, I will play my animation several times to feel the timing. So I can see that on the first bounce, there is something a bit off. Having the first upper position on frame 13 is a bit too soon. And we can figure this in the timeline. The upper pose is on frame 13 and the contact pose on frame 18. So I only have 3 frames to get up in the air and 5 to fall down. So I will offset all the keyframes from frame 13 by 1 frame, and then I will move all the keyframes from frame 18 or 19 by 1 frame back, so that I get an even spacing between the upper pose and the lower pose. The first bounce uses 8 frames to complete, so I guess we can use 6 frames to complete the second bounce. So frame 20 will be the contact pose, 23 the upper pose, 26 the next contact. And the final bounce could use 1 frame less. So our bouncing ball timing is quite logical. I start with a 8 frame bounce, then a 6 frame bounce, and finally a 4 frame bounce. It's totally fine if your timing is different. The important thing is to get this logical pattern between the first bounce and the last bounce, with a decreasing number of frames between each bounce. This logical approach of motion will help us solve some animation problem later on. It's not a rule of thumb though, because animation is also a matter of randomness. Our ball could be bouncing on an uneven ground, for example, so it will make the timing a bit off at some point. But in your learning path, it's important to understand the logic of motion. In this specific case, the fact that the ball is losing energy on each bounce, so the timing between each contact pose will be shorter. In the next video, we will polish the animation using the graph editor. To summarize, we have seen that we can use the grease pencil annotation to plan our animation. Using the motion path display is important even at the blocking stage, as it really helps us figuring out the motion of the ball. We have to be careful when using squash and stretch because it does communicate the softness or the material of our ball. So ask yourself, what kind of ball am I animating? We can tackle our animation timing with a logical approach. Our bouncing ball will lose energy on each bounce, so they will be smaller and smaller until it